On numbers 22 through 25, we are going to use the conditional statement, if two angles are right angles, then the angles are congruent, to find the converse, inverse, and contrapositive. We're going to find the truth value of each statement, and we'll write a biconditional if appropriate. What we're going to look at here is this part right here is what we call the hypothesis. So we're going to call that P. And then this part here, the angles are congruent, that's the Q. So when we write the converse of a statement, we're actually going to switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. We're going to do if Q then P. So in this case here, we're going to start with if two angles are congruent, then they are right angles. Now let's find the truth value of that. Let's suppose that the angle A is something like, measure of angle A is like 30 degrees, and the measure of angle B is 30 degrees. Both angles have 30 degrees as their measure, which means angle A is congruent to angle B. So if these two angles are congruent, it's saying that then they're right angles. Well, I just proved that that's not true. I found a counterexample. So this has a truth value of false. If you can find one counterexample, it is false. An inverse is when you negate P and then you negate Q, meaning find the opposite of them. So the inverse is if two angles are not right angles, so we're just doing the opposite of this hypothesis, then they are not congruent. What this statement is saying is that the only angles out there at all that are going to be congruent are going to be these right angles, which is not true here. So remember that the converse and the inverse should match in truth value. So if the converse is false, we do know that that inverse is false as well. The contrapositive is when we negate and we switch. So we're going to do the opposite of Q and the opposite of P. So we switch the P and the Q, and we're doing the negation of them. So going back to here, we're going to start with the conclusion. If the angles are not congruent, then they are not right angles. That's true. If we have angles that you know for a fact are not going to be congruent, then there's no way that they can be right angles. So that is true. And if you look at the original truth value for the first equation, or for the first conditional here, it says if two angles are right angles, then they are congruent, which is true. Your conditional, the original, and the contrapositive should always match in truth value as well. Since the original is true, the contrapositive is true as well. Now to write a biconditional, we can only write it if every single one of these truth values is false. Since they are not, we cannot write it. So there is no biconditional. If by some reason that this was all true, then you would write this using the words if and only if, starting right here. Two angles are right angles if and only if the angles are congruent. So if you're writing a biconditional statement, you're basically taking your hypothesis and your conclusion and connecting it with the words if and only if.